Hello. The poem that I'm going to look at today is another one of my favourites. It's Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. As always when we've looked at the poems, I've tried to give you some images which might help jog your memory, it might help secure the knowledge in your memory, and hopefully it will help to make a few things clear. The bottom left picture down here is an image which is what's described in the poem, a ruined statue, clearly Egyptian, in a mass of chaos. Here I've got the bottom right picture, I've got a picture of a desert. Deserts have long been used to represent eternity, and obviously we think of sand and sand timers up here as representing time, and you can see the link between those two. Hopefully the images become quite clear as we move through the poem. So as we've done before, if you already know this poem, then pause this video right now and answer the key questions. Try and do it without your notes, and then watch the video to make sure that your answers are correct. This idea of testing yourself is definitely the best method of revision, and you can use those three questions to revise this poem in the future. Okay, remember to pause the video regularly to take notes, use the layout on the next slide, and if you find them useful, get copies of the images for yourself. And like I've said, remember to test yourself regularly, or even better, have someone else test you. Little tests just help secure that knowledge in your long-term memory so it's there when you need it in the exam. Again, as always, I'm giving you the structure which I suggest for your notes, and again, as always, I'm going to stress that this is not everything about this poem. This poem is far more complex than can be broken down into these few areas, but this will be enough for you in your GCSE exam. So if you have a consistent layout for your notes, it will really help secure that knowledge for you. Okay, some context. Shelley was a romantic poet, contemporaneous around at the same time as Byron, a little bit after Wordsworth and Blake. He was, like all romantic poets, interested in nature, the imagination, but Shelley was particularly passionate about people having personal freedom and critical about people who abuse their power. In fact, much of Shelley's poetry was incredibly rebellious at the time, and much of it couldn't be published in his own lifetime. Some of it, particularly that written about the royal family, if you were to write similar poetry today, you would probably still be criticised quite harshly for the way that Shelley writes about the royal family at the time. At the time Shelley was writing, Britain was officially a democracy, but not really. Very few people had the vote. That meant people had very little power and couldn't really change their rulers. And the government at the time and the royal family were very dominant and did things pretty much their own way, with no accountability to the ordinary people in the streets. And this is something Shelley was very critical of. In fact, he was an early supporter of the French Revolution, where the royal family were guillotined and executed, and Shelley clearly felt that kind of revolutionary ideal of the people taking power for themselves was something that he supported. A little bit about Ozymandias. Ozymandias is the Greek name for an actual Egyptian pharaoh called Ramesses II. During his life, which was around 3,500 years ago, around 1300 BC, so that makes it, close to 3,500 years now, he would have been the most powerful person in the world. It's important that you know that for an understanding of this poem. Okay, the first things I've picked out are this language about destruction. Trunkless legs of stone. Trunk is the body, so these legs, as in the image at the beginning, no longer have a body. They're in the desert, and half sunk into the sand is the shattered face of the statue. And then at the bottom we have nothing beside remains. Beside the wreckage of this statue there is nothing. No thing is there, nothing. And it's called decay and a colossal wreck. So clearly this was once a great statue in probably a huge city, dominated by the most powerful man in the world, and now it's wrecked. So we've got this language about destruction, and Shelley shows us that power does not protect you. Eventually nature and time defeats all human beings. This guy, Ozymandias, Ramesses II, would in his lifetime have thought he was a god, the most powerful man in the world. And Shelley shows that with time, 3,000 years or so, he's nothing now. His statue's wrecked, and the whole civilization, there's nothing left of it. The houses, the temples, the shops, the buildings, all gone. All that's left is the remains of this statue. So it's like a warning that no matter how powerful you think you are, you can't defeat time. So language point 1, this language about destruction, showing what happens to human beings when they're faced with time. Okay, language point 2 is this quotation, and we can see it's put in quotation marks, and it's the inscription from the pedestal at the base of the statue. And it says on there, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It's like a boast, saying to other people, look at what I've built. No way will you be able to compete with me, so you may as well give up. But the use of irony here is very important, because nothing remains. There are no works to look on. Ozymandias had a boast and a threat to other people in the world. In fact, other kings, he calls them other mighty people, but everything that he built has been destroyed. So the irony here is really important, and the irony shows us that Ozymandias was arrogant, and that really the only thing that's mighty is time and nature, because it has absolutely defeated Ozymandias. So the irony in the boast shows us Ozymandias' arrogance. So I would pick that out as my second language point. The third language point I would pick out is this idea of the desert. And we've got stand in the desert, the sand, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. And we have this imagery of the desert at the beginning and the end of the poem. And this represents the total destruction of Ozymandias. There is nothing left, that's sand. Nature has broken his city down into the smallest possible particles that it could be, sand. But of course, sand also represents the passage of time, as we saw with the sand timer. So again, this imagery of the desert not only shows the absolute destruction of Ozymandias, but also that time will defeat all of us. No matter how powerful or how great we think we are, eventually we come to nothing. We're broken down into sand or dust. Next structural point, and I know normally only do two, but I think a third one's really important here, is that Shelley wrote this poem as a sonnet. It's 14 lines, it's iambic pentameter, and sonnets are, as we know from Sonnet 43, the traditional form of love poetry. Remember, this is our third sonnet. We have the Soldier, which is about love of country, Sonnet 43, which is much more traditional and shows love of somebody, and then we have this, Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. And here Shelley comments on the love of power, or the love of self. Ozymandias clearly seems wrapped up in himself in this poem, and we call that narcissism. But Shelley shows us that this is pointless and futile. You can't beat time. You can love yourself as much as you want, you can be proud of yourself and boastful, but eventually time will get you. All that will be left is the sand or the dust of your own destruction. And in this poem we see that Shelley uses structure further, and here we talk about it's like a story. We're being told the story by the poet, possibly Shelley, the I in the poem, who's been told the story by a traveller, who's been told the story by Ozymandias himself in reading the the inscription. So Shelley shows us that Ozymandias is no longer important. He's a story of a story of a story. He's just passed on. He's just like a bit of gossip or just an anecdote that you might tell someone over a casual chat. And he was once the most powerful man in the world. So we have this layered narrative here, this story within a story, this famous person, this great king, becoming nothing more than an anecdote. And finally, we need to look at the structure of Shelley's sonnet. If we look, it's usually sonnets are tightly structured. They have a really strict structure. Now this does have a lot of structure, but we've got frequent enjambment, these run-on lines, like one here, one here, one here, one here, and then down the bottom, decay and bear. These lines just run into one another. And also we've got the poem broken up in the middle of lines with this caesura, this punctuation in the middle of lines, and that makes it seem like everyday speech, like the story that we're being told is just a chat. It doesn't sound like a poem, and that's emphasised by this half rhyme: stone and frown, appear and despair. We can sort of sense there is some rhyme there, but it's not strict rhyme, which would make the poem sound very poetic. But it also might show us that human structures like rhyme schemes are easily broken down by time. So we've got this anecdote in the form of a sonnet showing the love of power or love of self, but this anecdote comes across, it reads like an ordinary conversation or a bit of speech, a story told to us from someone who heard a story from someone else. And it makes Ozymandias seem insignificant. He's just a little story, a bit of chat. Okay, Shelley shows us in this poem that human power does not last. You can be the most powerful person in the world, but eventually you will be forgotten. Civilizations will decay and break down, and you will be forgotten too. And when we think about the Egyptian civilization, the Greek civilization, the Roman civilization, we see that Shelley's right. But this is not really about Ozymandias or Ramesses II. This is really about the government and royalty in the 19th century when Shelley was writing. They were arrogant, they did abuse their power, and they didn't care for the population. And Shelley's reminding them that one day they'll be dust too, as Ozymandias is in this poem. Shelley also shows us that time is the great power, or nature is the great power, and has the power to destroy all human creations. The reader, I think, is reminded of the insignificance of human beings in this world. And it's a reminder that no matter how great you think you are, eventually you too will come to an end. I find the poem fascinating and powerful, with a message for us today. I think it's very easy. We all come across people who think that they're great, whether they be governments around the world, or individual people. And in Shelley's poem, he reminds us that no matter how great we might think we are, really, ultimately, we'll be remembered the same way as Ozymandias, either not at all, or just as a story to be told. I hope this has been useful, and I will see you for the last poem next time, which will be Hawk Roosting.